Donald Trump's wall has come to symbolize everything that's wrong with the Trump presidency. A project so unpopular that even the longest government shutdown in the country's history failed to generate a single dollar of additional funding for Trump's passion project. It's also Donald Trump's political ball and chain, and he's acting like without a wall or some shiny steel slats along the southern border, he may be in trouble in 2020. And that might explain today's blockbuster report in the New York Times. Helene Cooper reporting on the president's plan to spend money allotted for school construction at an Army base on his border wall instead, and the impact that decision will have on U.S. service members and their children. From that Times report, quote, for almost 2 decades, families at Fort Campbell, the sprawling Army base along the Kentucky-Tennessee border, have borne the brunt of the country's war efforts as a steady clip of troops with the 101st Airborne Division and from Special Operations units deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. This week, the families discovered that they would not get the new middle school they were expecting so that President Trump could build his border wall. The Pentagon's decision to divert $62.6 million from the construction of Fort Campbell's middle school means that 552 students in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade will continue to cram themselves in, 30 to a classroom in some cases, at the base's aging Mahaffey Middle School. The story includes this from Jane Loggins, a teacher at Fort Campbell, who says, quote, most of our students don't know what it's like to live in a world without war, where you don't have to worry about mom or pop being killed. The one big benefit of this school is that we try to support all those emotional needs. Funding for Fort Campbell is something that the state senator Mitch McConnell's bragged about, including in an op-ed in his local paper back in January, where he wrote this, quote, our Commonwealth is the proud home of military installations critical to our national defense. I secured much needed assistance for Fort Campbell, helping the men and women serving there to keep America safe. But when the New York Times contacted his office about Fort Campbell's school funding being raided for Trump's wall, his office blamed Democrats. A spokesman saying this, quote, we wouldn't be in this situation if Democrats were serious about protecting our homeland and work with us to provide the funding needed to secure our borders during our appropriations process. So Mitch McConnell, the most powerful senator in the country, is blaming Democrats, even though it's his political ally, Donald Trump, siphoning off money from a base in his state to fund the president's campaign promise. But building a wall isn't the only campaign promise on the line here. Trump has made promises to the military as well.
I can tell you there's nobody that respects the military more than your president, Donald Trump.
I will be so good at the military, your head will spin.
There's nobody bigger or better at the military than I am.
Would you like to have served generally, perhaps in another?
I would not have minded that at all. I would have been honored, but I think I make up for it right now.
And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Retired 4-star general and NBC military analyst Barry McCaffrey. Mark Jacobson's back, former senior advisor to Defense Secretary Ash Carter, plus Axios political reporter Alexi McCammon with us on set, Vanity Fair national correspondent Emily Jane Fox, and New York Times political reporter Nick Conversori's here. General McCaffrey, I'm going to start with you. I hit myself every time I'm surprised by the audacity of something Donald Trump did. So imagine how many times I hit myself reading that New York Times article this morning. What do you think?
Well, look, at the end of the day, this is a seizure of Department of Defense funds. The Military Construction Authority construction budget goes through a 5-year process. Congressmen are intimately involved in it. It does affect the readiness and the family welfare of the U.S. Armed Forces, both here and overseas. Congress refused to fund that wall, and the president has taken an emergency declaration and essentially defied Congress on the power of the purse. I think it's unprecedented. It's simply astonishing. And they got our new Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mark Esper, to sign off on it that he could use these funds for a different purpose. So I think it's a fundamental threat to the way our democracy works.
General McCaffrey, I wonder if you can just speculate on how this happens. I mean, I think for presidents, Democratic and Republican presidents, there are people around them in the White House before an idea this harebrained gets to the Pentagon. And then there are people, hopefully, ideally, traditionally at the Pentagon that would stop something like this from happening. There's a national security advisor that could stop something. How are we here where at Fort Campbell, where it has to have one of the highest numbers of deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, they're being deprived of a middle school? I don't need to tell anyone with kids that's a pretty crucial age.
Yeah, plus, it's also things like funding for Air Force-based fire and crash rescue services. So it's both operational and family-oriented. I'd be interested in seeing how Secretary Mark Esper in the Department of Defense got his own lawyers to sign off on this as legal. I've dealt with a lot of military budgets. If we divert money from one purpose to another, even when we think we have the legal authority, we always would go back to the Congressional Appropriations Committee and seek their support. Apparently, that whole system's now broken down. And I think the president feels, apparently, he has the authority under emergency powers to move funds and not go to Congress under the power of the purse. We're getting into troubled waters here.
General McCaffrey, could you just speak personally about the toll it takes on men and women deployed, how much time they spend worrying about their family? I mean, so much of what is provided on bases in terms of childcare, in terms of counseling, and in terms of support for families is so that the men and women fighting to protect us don't have these burdens, don't have to worry about those things. What is sort of the psychological toll on the military?
Well, fortunately, it's far less than it was a few years ago. We've got only around 15,000 troops into Iraq, maybe 8,000, Afghanistan, 8,000 in Iraq, and several thousand elsewhere. But look, the bottom line is the armed forces have been at war for 18 years. Some of these special ops personnel or Air Force C-130 squadrons or Navy SEAL teams have been deployed a dozen times. We've had, and I have to remind people of this, we've had essentially 60,000 killed and wounded fighting the war on terror. So it's an ongoing, constant deployment for the armed forces. And, at the end of the day, we really need to give them the tools and to take care of their families. So we call them at midnight and tell them you're leaving, you're going to be gone 6 months, you're going to be fighting in Afghanistan. They know that the system is behind them. This strikes at the heart of that whole process.
Nick Confessore, it's an incredible piece of reporting from your colleague. And I just want to reread this quote, because this was the gut punch for me. This is from a teacher at Fort Campbell, Jane Loggins, who says this: most of our students don't know what it's like to live in a world without war, where you don't have to worry about mom or pop being killed. The one big benefit of this school is that we try to support all those emotional needs. This school that has some overcrowding issues, the funding has been gutted to pay for Donald Trump's steel slats or whatever we're calling it this week.
This is an important story because it shows that there is a human cost to these budget gimmicks that the president is using to pay for his wall. This is a school that serves the children of the 101st. They've been deployed over and over again. They've borne a lot of the brunt of these wars we've fought. Their kids are going to school in a place where there isn't enough room for them to eat lunch in the cafeteria, where there's no air conditioning in some places, where there are leaks, and we're sending their parents to go fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I do think it shows, look, if there was some national emergency and there was a consensus that we had to find dollars and move them to pay for something else important, that would be one thing. But there is no consensus. Congress has the power of the purse. It is not appropriated this money for his wall. This is a big end run. And it is in the service of a presidential fiction that we're being invaded from the South, that we haven't got a wall there, that we have to have a huge wall. We have a wall there. It's working pretty good. Our border defenses are pretty good. It's a manufactured crisis for political purposes, and these kids are one people who are bearing the brunt of it.
You know, Mark Jacobson, Nick just said something really important. It's in the service of a fiction. And I've always hoped and thought that the fictions, this president this week, we spent 3 days talking about the fiction of Alabama being in the path of Hurricane Dorian, a fiction created and furthered by Donald Trump's Sharpie. I'd always hoped that Donald Trump's fictions would be walled off from the military, and it would appear, and I agree with Nick's assessment, that that is just not the case.
Yeah, the reality here is that this administration is long past the time where they're going to do something because it's moral, because it's ethical, or because it's just or good. But the reality is the actions that the Secretary of Defense has signed off on, they are hurting military readiness. It's not just, it's not just the military construction. It's also aircraft simulators. It's small arms ranges. And it's also undermining our deterrence and our credibility in Europe. Secretary Esper said just yesterday evening, during his trip to Europe, that the Europeans are going to have to pick up the slack on some of the money the Department of Defense won't be able to spend now. That's undercutting one of the major missions of the department. And then finally, to get to this heart of the schools issue, it's well known that military, I think General McCaffrey would agree, militaries recruit soldiers but retain families. And right now, Trump has a dagger pointed at the heart of those families. So it's not just the emotional argument, it's that he's hurting our readiness, that he's distracting soldiers from focusing on the mission, and undermining our deterrent posture in Europe.
General McCaffrey, your name's been invoked. I'd like you to respond to anything Mark said that you want to elaborate on. But I'd also like you to address some of the politics of this. I mean, if Donald Trump were a Democratic president and he were raiding the military budget in almost an extrajudicial manner in terms of not following the laws that Congress has the legal right to appropriate funds, I think Republicans would be going bananas. I mean, how is Donald Trump going to survive a move like this politically in terms of the deep and emotional and historical support that the military and the Pentagon traditionally has in Congress?
Well, I think we're so polarized now, Nicole, it's hard to even imagine that either party in past years would have accepted this kind of extrajudicial action by the President of the United States. I mean, at the end of the day, if you read English, if you read the Constitution, Congress has to appropriate money. And if they have deliberately not chosen to fund the wall, whether you like it or not, then it's hard to understand how the lawyers in the Department of Defense or any other department of government could justify seizure of funds and divert to a new mission. So we're just on new ground. I cannot imagine how a Republican in the Appropriations Committee of the House or the Senate would not see this as striking at the heart of congressional power.
Alexi McCammon, you've got some reporting on this very topic. What are, and I'm just going to guess it's Democrats, because Republicans have to this point in the Trump presidency marched in lockstep with this president no matter what he's doing. What is the plan to either reverse these decisions or draw attention to their foolishness?
So that's right. Today, I obtained a document that was compiled by the DNC's research team that sort of outlines all of the times that President Trump said, as he was campaigning for president back in 2016, that Mexico would pay for the wall and how it was going to be paid for by Mexico and no one else, and we didn't have to worry about anything. And this document shows in great detail not just the things that he said, but where he said it in these crucial battleground areas. And I've been told from various Democrats that I've spoken with who are sort of familiar with the plan that the National Party and other Democratic groups are doing to try to sort of thwart his efforts to make this happen without people really noticing, is to target in these hyperlocal areas in these battleground states like Florida, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, target these voters in these communities by showing them exactly what he has said and the promises he has made and the inconsistencies in what has actually happened since he made those promises. And ultimately, let's not forget, got elected based on these promises by the sort of little guys and gals that he was looking out for or saying he was looking out for by things like having Mexico pay for this wall, among other things. And so they're really trying to go for this hyper-local strategy to divine Donald Trump more than just this general or ambiguous broken promises idea, but to focus on what has actually happened now that he has a policy record, which for Oppo researchers, especially Democratic Oppo researchers, this policy record that President Trump has accumulated and the things he's trying to move forward on, like what he's doing with military funds to pay for the border wall instead, are a dream to them because they didn't have that in 2016. We saw the the ways in which Oppo research didn't really stick to Trump in certain ways that it would with others, but something like a policy record and these failed promises that sort of go against everything and everyone he said he stood for when he's campaigning is one way to try to really define him that could lead to their success.
All right, you know what else sticks to Donald Trump even more than Oppo research? Attacks from Fox News. Here's one from Judge Napolitano.
When Donald Trump imposes a sales tax on items from China, when he builds a wall at the Mexico-Texas border using funds that the Congress denied him, but he takes the funds anyway, he is merely using the power that Congress has given to him and former presidents in violation of the Constitution. When that happens, when Congress throws up its hands and says, let the president do it, that's dangerous to our liberty, because the beauty of our liberty is the division, the separation of powers. Congress writes the laws, the president enforces them, the courts interpret them. But when Congress lets presidents write their own laws, then he's not a president, he's a prince.
So, Alexei, the Democrats may have some assistance in terms of echoing their message in places that it could really hurt from none other than Fox News on-air talent, Judge Napolitano.
And I think that's a good point, Nicole, because obviously the Democrats are preparing this type of Oppo research for their own gains. But something like this is not really a partisan issue when you consider the fact that Democrats are pointing out to Trump voters in these key battleground states that, of course, they're hoping to win in 2020, that Trump has screwed them over. He's not just screwing Democrats over, he's screwing Republicans over, too, in these things that he's doing. And the more Republicans like Napolitano from Fox or others who speak out on these issues, the more that might add pressure to someone like Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, we've seen the ways in which he will drag his heels and dig in 2 and 3 times to get whatever he wants on a border wall, going so far as to divert these funds or shut down the government. So I'm not sure if someone like Napolitano will convince him otherwise, but I think that could certainly add to the pressure and sort of the gravity of what Democrats are putting forward.
Mark Jacobson, something else that could add to the pressure would be former secretaries of defense. Do you expect your old boss, Ash Carter, to speak out, or someone like Secretary Gates or General Mattis is in the midst of a book tour? Do you expect to hear from any of them?
Well, I guess we all want to hear what Secretary Mattis wants to say, but I suspect you're right there. I think that former Secretary Panetta has been more outspoken than the others. But what I'd also like to see are retired general officers speaking out against this, particularly in terms of the war on military families. You know, we have the war on education, the war on children right now. But you know, we're really getting at the heart of what the military is about. It's about its people, and I'd like to hear from retired military leaders from you know, a substantive standpoint on why this is the wrong policy.
Emily Jane Fox, Mark mentioned the war on children. It's the topic of an op-ed in the Washington Post today that goes like this. Even without Trump's baby jails and proposed Medicaid cuts, our country's emphasis on children's well-being is seriously deficient. Spending on children as a share of the federal budget is also expected to shrink over the coming decade, crowded out by both debt service and spending on the elderly. Whatever the opposite of Trump's war on children is, that is what Democrats should be running on. Do I remember this correctly? Was Ivanka going to maybe spend some time on women and children, or did that get scuttled? Is that not the plan?
Well, that's the original purpose of her
brand
moving to Washington and skirting anti-nepotism laws that were on the books for 50 years. That was the whole reason why she got that corner office in the Oval, in the West Wing, right above the Oval Office. She's actually on a foreign trip right now promoting women in entrepreneurship because it's her role in the West Wing to be supporting women and families. But it's funny, on issues like this, where her father is either gutting schools for military families or keeping children in cages on the border or looting school budgets for any other number of reasons to pay for fake crises on the border, that she goes silent, she disappears, and she'd rather pose for photo ops and actually do the hard work of standing up to her father and saying, this is wrong. If I'm here to advocate for women and children, there's no better way to advocate than saying, let's keep these schools that will support militaries in place. But this is the fiction of Ivanka Trump's role. We all sort of hoped and prayed that they would maybe be this moderating influence, and I think Anyone who
This
still
isn't even
believes
moderate. This is
anyone who
humanizing
believes there
influence.
is a humanizing or moderating influence or any real policy influence at all coming from the first daughter has been fooled for the last 2.5 years.
General McCaffrey, I want to give you the last word on this topic. Michelle Obama and Dr. Jill Biden made the health and well-being of military families, which in a lot of cases is spouses and children, their central causes. I guess there are a lot of things to miss about the Obama presidency, but their focus on that issue and the vacuum created by the removal of a focus on that issue at a time when it's not just that there's still troops deployed, there's still a heavy burden that our military is carrying, and I don't need to tell you that. What do they need? I mean, what needs to be made up based on the deficit from this president and this White House?
Well, you're actually quite right that both the First Lady and Jill Biden were very focused on directly supporting military families. And it's been a huge part of it. Somebody earlier mentioned, you know, we recruit individual soldiers, we retain families. So they're part and parcel of the national security process. If you take away an assurance that, look, we've got your back, the medical care, the housing, the emotional needs of children will be met, then you got a stronger force. This seizure of DOD funds, though, I would argue goes well beyond supporting military families. This is basically, it seems at first glance to be extra constitutional seizure of funds, and we can't live with that in a democracy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.